Hello and welcome to Social Studies 2201, Unit 4, Economic Change. Last time around, we looked at some developments in medieval economy, such as the commercial revolution, expanding trade routes, and development of banking, that would help increase economic activity at the end of the Middle Ages and lead to um, Europe taking a place of primacy in terms of economic development. In this section, we'll take a look at how European trade expanded beyond um, its own local area to become much more global in nature. Uh, if you remember back earlier in the year, we talked about the voyages of discovery. And these were really um, expeditions by, well, explorers that took place over a couple of hundred years from the late 1400s into the 1700s. Um, and as we know, it was a way of expanding European knowledge of the physical world um, by discovering, for example, North and South America, which Europeans did not know existed before that. Um, but the need for valuable trade goods was a key element in why these voyages occurred in the first place. And that's linked directly with economic development and trade, which we will see going through this section. Europe enjoyed a long history of long distance trade with Asia, as we had mentioned in the last section. Um, and, luxury goods such as cotton, silk, and spices were key to European economy, but also maintaining a high level of quality of life relative to the time. So, why sail west is a question that we'll ask here. Why would these Europeans, if they had already been expanding their own trade locally and becoming far more profitable, why would they continue to sail west and further develop? Um, the two biggest reasons we have for this is linked with new innovations um, and desiring uh, sources of luxury goods. If we look at the first one, technology, when it comes to navigation and sea travel, would make it safer, faster, um, and more practical, I guess, or pragmatic to explore regions further away. So that's one thing we'll look at, and we'll also look at um, the fact that for the benefit of their own economies, the Europeans not only wanted luxury goods, but they wanted to control areas that had luxury goods that so therefore they could basically produce their own and therefore not be reliant on other foreign regions for those goods and the wealth that comes from it. So we look at technology side of things. A couple of different ship designs at the time in the 15th, 17th centuries made sea exploration safer and easier. The Caravel is the first ship noted up here. It's not a particularly large ship, um, but it was maneuverable, fairly durable, and for that reason, made it an ideal ship for exploration. Okay, it could travel over a large area relatively quickly, um, and for the purposes of discovery, it was ideal. Uh, it did not have much in the way of cargo space, so it's not going to be a trade ship in particular. Okay. The Carrack, on the other hand, was much larger. You can see a picture of one down here. Okay. Um, Carrack is a larger ship that's basically became the ships that would go on either very long distance exploratory missions or would become trade vessels. It had a larger size, three or four masts, and a much greater storage capacity. So they could store more food and rations for themselves, for the members of the crew, in terms of survival and safety. But also when it comes to trade goods, they could bring more items with them that they could trade with others. Or it would also mean that they had more space on board to bring uh, new items back to Europe. Okay. Both ships were quite expensive. It's hard to know exact dollar values, but we'll say at least $250,000 for each in order to produce them. So these expeditions, both exploratory and trade, were really quite expensive. Um, some of these trade fleets had four, five, or more of these vessels. So you're looking at a considerable amount of money. Um, and this brought up an issue. If you were a merchant, even if you had a fair amount of money and you wanted to get involved in one of these overseas uh, exploratory or trading missions, you would have to put up a lot of your own money in order to construct or buy ships like caravels and carracks. And due to the distance, um, the issue with predicting storms and that type of safety concern, you would take on considerable risk. As a merchant, you might put uh, a lot of money into one of these operations only to see that money lost and any potential profit lost uh, if your ship or ships were lost at sea. So it was a very risky thing to do. And for that reason, a lot of merchants wouldn't want to do it. Uh, and this is where the idea of the joint stock company starts. Joint stock company helped popularize and make these trade expeditions and exploratory travel easier and economically safer, right? So, a joint stock company is a business venture where people combine their wealth for a common purpose. So, you have more than one merchant involved. Maybe you have 50, maybe there's 100 different people who are all putting money into this operation. And if that's the case, then each person puts in less money than they would if they were funding the entire thing. But the idea is that they would get some benefit out of it, right? So it's relatively small investment for a potentially larger gain. And therefore, if you were one of these people and something went wrong with the mission and you did lose a ship or whatever, you weren't the only investor. So therefore, you didn't put all the capital or the investment money up front. You might have lost what you put up there, but it wasn't anywhere near as much as it would be had you been the only investor. So it distributes risk amongst a greater number of people and therefore makes it a bit more inviting for investors because they know if something goes wrong, they're not going to lose everything. And if it goes right, they have a potential for a considerable amount of profit. Many joint stock companies were supported by government charters. These are official documents released by the government that grants rights and privileges, usually to a particular uh, group of people. Um, in this case, charters, many of these charters outlined the region in which a particular joint stock company can operate. And it might say that one particular company is the only company allowed to operate in this given area. Okay, so it more or less gave joint stock companies a monopoly over trade or trade of a particular good in a given region. So, for example, uh, tea was a major trade good from India. Um, the British East India Company would have been a major joint stock company that was involved in that trade, and they would have had privileges that gave them advantages through a charter to conduct trade and be very profitable at it in let's say in the tea industry. Just by way of example. So historically, joint stock companies sold shares to raise money for these trading expeditions, and that's where people would buy in, right? So you'd buy so many shares or a percentage of shares in the company, and therefore you get um, any profits, you get an equivalent um, amount of benefit from it at the end of the day. Okay. So the English were the first to use joint stock companies. The very first one recognized was called the Company of Merchant Adventurers to New Lands. Sounds quite adventurous and kind of romantic in a way. Um, but it was in the mid 1500s that company received its charter. And to give you an idea, it had about 250 shareholders at the time. Okay. Other companies would become far more popular or well known or influential. The English or later British East India Company was a major one, uh, granted its charter in the year 1600. And that company would operate for many, many, many years. Okay. Uh, and again, by charter, that company, English East India Company, was given, in particular, a 15-year monopoly on all trade in the East Indies. Okay, so by law, these companies had advantages, and that was sort of a governmental way of ensuring economic development and benefit and the accumulation of wealth for these nations. It was an important enough and profitable enough thing that the government got involved legally to help support these companies and the wealth they could bring in. So we get a couple of main benefits that we've talked about of joint stock companies. One, it distributes and lessens investment risk, meaning more people would probably get involved, which would expand the amount of trade um, and therefore improve or increase economic development. You can raise large sums of money, um, more so than what one or two investors could put in. You might have, as we said, for example, 250 shareholders, which would greatly increase the amount of money that can be used for any one um, trade expedition. Successful voyages reap huge profits with trade in new items and markets. So this would be the luxury goods and regions where you would acquire them, but also where you would sell them to, which might be a foreign region or it could be back home in your European country. And a substantial middle class of merchants would continue to develop. We saw this start at the end of the Middle Ages as you get banking developments making it easier and safer for merchants to do more work and trade. But we see it take off considerably here in the early modern period as well. Okay. And this would attract even more investors. Okay. So you'll get continual increase in the amount of trade that is likely to occur or the potential for it. So you have a map of some of the European exploration that occurred in the early modern era. Most of the voyages on the map were funded by joint stock companies. So each of these arrows show where various explorers went. Um, and, at any given point, there could be an incredible number of trade opportunities or certainly potential along the way. Joint stock companies were used to set up the first colonies in North America. So whether that's the colonies that would later form the United States or colonies um, around, establishing uh, early governments in Newfoundland and the Maritimes in Eastern Canada. Either way, joint stock companies were key in doing this. Um, in terms of Canada, probably the best known joint stock company that existed was the Hudson Bay Company, uh, which operated in much of central Canada. and is still around today, even though it's got a different name. It's just called the Bay today, but again, significant joint stock company. So once established, these companies tended to not only control trade in the colonies, but they took on governmental roles, particularly in examples of colonization in India, for example, where we get um, the British East India Company managing the local affairs of its territory within India, and doing it on behalf of um, England. So they have some form of not only managing trade and buying and selling, but there's some degree of law enforcement. These companies often hired their own military presence to enforce and protect their interests as well. So this brings us to what we call mercantilism, which is a major economic theory and uh, policy really put into practice in the early modern period. Uh, so as trade expanded across the globe, European countries sought to gather as much wealth as they could. Okay, so they assumed that wealth was finite, that there was only a certain amount of it. You can never increase the amount of it on the planet. It's almost like a pie. There's the particular pie, and then it might be divided up into slices or pieces. And the goal of mercantilism was to acquire as many pieces of the pie as possible. And quite often that looked like trade goods. It looked like regions to trade in, and often gold and silver as physical sources of wealth. Um, and this was the dominant process that or policy that Western European nations followed from the 1500s into the 1700s. It's why they sought to increase the number of trade goods and the amount of wealth they had, because wealth quite often equals power. The more money you have, the more influence you have, the more you can get things done to suit your own needs. So this became a major, um, as we said, economic policy going into the early modern period. And the key idea, as we said, was to acquire as much wealth as possible. And any trade you did, you wanted to make sure that you acquired what we call a positive balance of trade. And a balance of trade basically looks at the expenses you have for imports versus the profit you make from exports. Right? So if you have to import goods, more or less you're buying from someone else, which means money is going out of your country. But if you're exporting, you're selling. So goods go out, money comes in. So positive balance of trade is basically when you have more exports, you're selling more than you're buying. So this, combined with stockpiling gold and silver, would result in more money and wealth in the country. And this is, by and large, what countries like England and France, in terms of an economic policy, is by and large what they followed for the space of probably, we'll say, over 2 centuries in the early modern period. We have some consequences of this. First, straight up, is going to be colonization or colonialism. Uh, in order to acquire a bigger piece of the pie or more pie, uh, these countries would generally dominate other territories, right? So some countries acquired overseas territories for the purpose of securing resources and creating markets for sale of goods. Uh, for example, if we look at colonization in Africa, we get England more or less dominating the area of what's now Nigeria for the purpose of acquiring its goods, selling goods manufactured with Nigerian resources, uh, both back in Europe, but also back to people in Nigeria. So it's a scenario that really boosts the amount of wealth that in that example that England would have. The same uh, applies to Newfoundland um, in terms of uh, seafood resources, fish, and so on. Um, but it involved dominance, political and economic dominance of one territory um, by another. And that became a common thing that many European countries did across the globe. More on that uh, in the next unit. Mercantilism involves strict governmental intervention. We already mentioned how joint stock companies acquired charters from the government. Um, it more or less was government force and regulation and law that helped support the activities of business. Um, and giving some companies exclusive rights to operate in some areas over others. So that's going to create some advantages for some, and if they're lucky enough to benefit that way. But also, it's going to create significant challenges for uh, people who cannot benefit in the same way. More on that later. Uh, Economic, and I should add in social exploitation of people here as well. These territories were dominated and exploited in terms of their resources and their wealth, um, and their capacities as uh, markets as well for trade. So the resources and wealth of one country were used to benefit another. Another significant point to mention here, of course, would be social exploitation in terms of the slave trade. We know that many people were taken from uh, regions such as Africa and exported to North America and so on as slaves to help fuel economic systems being put in place in these regions. And so, you know, the direct experience of these people, their rights, their safety, and their lives as property of other people. Um, these things all had massive human rights effects for people for these slave groups. So another major uh, negative consequence that came from mercantilism. So here we have a map which shows the basic system fueled by mercantilism that included three main regions. We get Europe up here, Africa here, North America over here. And I just mentioned about the slave trade and slaves being moved from Africa to North America and so on, Central America as well. This is all part of economic development as seen at the time. Um, Certainly, we have issues with a lot of that today. But it was all part of mercantilism, which used what we refer to as triangular trade. And this is a term that refers to the economic connection between these three major regions that we just mentioned. For example, um, let's say European country might export weapons, cloth, iron, and beer, for example, down to places in Africa and through their joint stock companies. And those companies might export gold, ivory, spices, other luxury goods back to Europe, but also, as we said already, slaves to the Caribbean and North America. North America, on the other hand, would receive uh, slaves, but would also function as a point of production for goods such as whale oil, lumber, furs, uh, rice, tobacco, sugar, molasses, any number of goods that would be exported back to Europe. Uh, and so it's important to see here that there's trade connections between all three members here. So we said that there's goods that go from North America to Europe. There's some goods that go from North America to Africa, like rum, iron, gunpowder, cloth, and tools, and so on. Um, and then Africa receives goods, but also exports to both Europe and North America. And Europe, on the other end, receives probably the greatest number and range of goods, but also exports, in particular, manufactured goods. So these are some of the items that uh, might be made with resources from the colonies and then sold back to the colonies. Okay, so this system of exchange, which is really a global system as it takes in part of the old world and the new here, um, is generally called the Columbian Exchange. Okay, and it included exchange or transfer of plants, animals, disease, even from one part of the world to another, slaves and food. Okay. Um, when we look at who was primarily the beneficiary of this system, it's going to be uh, European nations. Okay, they received most of the goods and they were able to manufacture and sell a lot of goods to these other regions. So, therefore, the balance of trade in this system would be positive in Europe's favor. Okay, and that's an important point to keep in mind there. So, at this point, we have an activity 10.2 Mercantilism.